All right. Hello, everyone. Can you all see and hear me okay? Excellent. Okay. Yes, I am. Thank you, Finn. But just in case I got another cough drop locked and loaded on deck, ready to go. I don't think I was sick. I think I screamed. Well, someone gave me like a giant handful, which was really kind of them. So thank you for that again. Um, They gave me this giant handful of them and a pack of Halls, so I'm okay. I don't think I'm sick. I think I messed up my voice. As I was saying, I went to a show last Friday, um, and I was like, cheering a lot. Probably strained my voice. I also went to a show on Tuesday, so I'm hoping that my voice holds up today. But if not, we got a lot of cough drops, so we should be okay. Oh, well, on Friday, my friend took me to see Comeback Kid. It was their 25th anniversary tour. It's not my usual jam. It's like a metalcore, hardcore kind of thing, and but I thought they did a great job. On Tuesday, I saw Hail the Sun and Between the Buried and Me. Never seen Hail the Sun, but Between the Buried and Me is one of my all-time favorite bands. What an amazing show. They just knocked it out of the park. I will definitely be back to see them for a fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, etc. time. But hopefully my voice holds up. Okay, so before we get to resuming our learning materials today, I just want to reiterate, like, I am really happy that lots of discussion is happening in the chat. Like, that's a good thing. But I do want us to keep the questions focused on the material. And if you have a question that could put, I mean, I know you don't really have a way of knowing this, but a lot of the questions I'm getting are answered like right away as I'm proceeding. So I would save questions until after we've finished a section. Um, so I'm gonna review Kant and the synthetic a priori, right? Uh, if you have questions, I'll answer them after I'm finished that review. Then we'll talk about Quine. Then you can ask questions. Then we'll talk about Kripke. Then you can ask your questions, right? And if there are like questions that need a lot of discussion, we can put those in the Discord server, and I'll answer them, either in the evening after class or at some point the next day. And that way we can just stay on track. I'm not really worried about us running out of time, but it's more like when I'm a bit of a blabbermouth, so I can get launched on a tangent with the wrong sort of question, and it takes me a minute to kind of get back on track, right? Um, so Kant and the synthetic a priori. Remember, Kant is uh, he's been awakened from his dogmatic slumber, right, by reading Hume. Hume, of course, as we learned about last time and the week before. Um, Thought that reliance on something like the uniformity principle was not rationally justified and that there's no necessary connection between cause and effect. Um, Kant and his transcendental idealism, that's an attempt to fix that, right? Because if there's no necessary connection between cause and effect, and we don't have a rational license for reliance on UP, we can't be certain of scientific knowledge, right? And this is like um, during and immediately after the scientific revolution, where these sorts of discussions are taking place. So remember that philosophers and scientists were the same people a lot of the time, including Kant, right? We tend to forget that Kant also did what we would today call science, but he did. So did Descartes, as we discussed last week. So these philosophers slash scientists were not only worried about, well, they weren't worried. They were anxious to discover new things about the world, but also worried about whether those things they were learning met the standard of knowledge. And that's why epistemology is important, right? You can't do science and claim to know anything unless you already know about knowledge, right? So philosophy, epistemology in this case, is almost like pre-scientific, if you like. So Kant says, look, okay, what if, and this is his Copernican revolution thing, what if instead of making the objects conform to our cognition, we make our cognition conform to the objects? Just like how Copernicus said, well, what if the sun doesn't go around the earth? What if the earth goes around the sun? Copernicus was able to make more parsimonious. Um, he was able to make the models of the cosmos more parsimonious. That is simpler but still correct by doing this. And Kant hoped to do this with metaphysics. And remember, our minds, for Kant on his theory, impose a sort of structure on what we perceive. So the mind, it's not a thing that we think with. It also structures how we perceive and think about the world. It's not just a thing we think with. It does those other things. So there are like forms of sensible intuition, like space and time, and pure categories of understanding, like quantity, quality, modality, etc. So the mind imposes this structure, and so we've got our synthetic a priori statement. Um, all events have a cause uh, is not an analytic statement because when it comes to actual events, we have to look at the world and actually learn something new. But we can know a priori that all events have a cause, not because there's a necessary connection between cause and effect, but because that's how the mind structures the world for us. It structures it causally. Um, Now, here's an interesting consequence. We can never know anything directly. We can never know the things in themselves directly, as Kant called them. That's because of the way our mind structures our experience of them. We can know that they exist, right? I know that this coffee cup exists. I know that I can causally affect it or that it can causally affect other things. For example, I can pick up the cup. I can cause the cup to come up here so I can take a sip. And by drinking the coffee, that might cause me to feel more awake. But I don't know the coffee cup itself, only a representation of it. So there's some questions here. Oh, no problem. Yeah. Yeah, Pernille. All causes are preceded by effects, but we don't know this um a posteriori. We know it a priori because of the structure that our minds impose upon our experiences. Now, Kant is tricky. So if you find this, if you're like, what? That's okay. Um, keep thinking about it. Keep letting it stew. Um, so yeah, this is transcendental idealism. I'm sympathetic to something like this, right? Because it's true. Think about it. I mean, move away from Kant just for a moment and focus on the idea of representation, right? When you see this coffee cup on the screen, what are you seeing? And this is where you can jump in the chat and answer. Pixels, yeah. It looks like a coffee cup, and your mind is like, "Oh yeah, that's a coffee cup," but it's not the coffee cup. It's pixels on a screen that represent a coffee cup. Likewise, in well, IRL, right? In real life, I'm sitting here at this picnic table outside of Taranga Commons, and I got my coffee cup on the table, and I look at the coffee cup. Am I seeing the cup? No, I'm having a mental representation of the cup because there's light reflecting off of its surface. Some of that light reaches my retinas. It goes down through my optic tract into my optic nerves, goes down to the occipital cortex and my primary visual areas, and then up from there into my temporal areas. And I eventually come to have a conscious visual experience of the coffee cup, but it's very indirect, right? So I know there's a coffee cup here, but this is not the coffee cup. Everything I see, touch, taste is a mental representation of the coffee cup. So, in that sense, that I can't know the coffee cup directly, that's also the sense in which Kant says we cannot know objects directly, only as they are presented to us via the mind. Is anything really seen? I would say yes, but not directly, right? Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we are going to talk about this later in the course. We're going to talk about representative realism and naive realism, subjective idealism. We're going to talk about all this stuff. So I'm not going to hash this out too much longer. I only bring it up to try and make Kant a little bit more intuitive for all of you. Nicholas, go ahead.
Yeah, before we move on, I just want to ask one quick question. Is
Sure.
Kant's idea that the mind imposes a pre-existing structure such as cause and effect on our experience somewhat similar to Chomsky's language acquisition device in the sense that he believes our mind is born with a pre-imposed structure to understand language? So
Yeah,
are those
great question. Yeah, I would say they're similar in the sense that they're both things that Chomsky and Kant believe are innate, right? Like Chomsky thinks universal grammar is innate. Kant thinks that the categories of the understanding and the forms of sensible intuition are also innate. So when we say innate, we mean we're born with it, right? So I would say yes. Yeah, and that's a really good insight. One more question. Khalid asks, how does Kant's theory account for things that are independent from our mind, such as a mountain that has been there longer than? Well, he doesn't deny that there's a world out there, right? He's not like later in the course we're going to talk about Bishop George Berkeley, who thought that there are no physical objects. Everything is just ideas. So it's kind you kind of come to the question like, well, what happens when things aren't being perceived? Um, right? If I hate to use this silly example, but if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? You might worry about that if you think everything is idea and not, objects. Barclay says it's okay because God is perceiving everything everywhere all of the time. So God is like the guarantor of the stability of reality, right? But Kant would say, no, there is a world out there. And, we can go and look at parts of it. It doesn't mean the parts we're not seeing don't exist or the parts that existed before we were around don't exist. It just means that whatever is out there, we can only know it indirectly because of the way the mind, again, imposes this structure on our experiences. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. I just realized I didn't actually start the slideshow. It's like, why does my screen look so different? I didn't start the slideshow. So that's transcendental idealism. The reason we're talking about this is because Kant is one of the first philosophers to kind of throw a wrench in this a priori, a posteriori distinction, right? So recall that a priori knowledge is knowledge that can be had independently of sense experience or prior to sense experience. And a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that you can have after sense experience. And Kant remarks how, okay, so most a priori propositions, that is, sentences that say something about the world, most of those are analytic. So that they contain the um, predicate concept within the subject concept. And most a posteriori propositions are synthetic because their subject concept doesn't contain the predicate concept. But Kant's identified a synthetic a priori statement. Um, all events have a cause, right? So he kind of messes with he makes the distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge a little bit fuzzy. And so does Quine, who we're going to talk about next. That's transcendental idealism, Mackenzie. Yeah, it's on the previous slide. So we'll go back. It's right down at the bottom. So transcendental idealism. If you want to know more about it, I can't launch into a whole big spiel on this just because we would never finish our lecture, right? But the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great place to read about this. It's also the only encyclopedia I will let you cite in your essays. Um, no Wikipedia, no Britannica. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is okay, though. All right, let's talk about Quine. So remember, for empiricists, uh, but not exactly Kant, analytic propositions provide the only a priori that there is. So, and remember, analytic propositions, this is like getting back to the linguistic view of the a priori. So David Hume, A.J. Ayer, they would both agree that sure, we can know things a priori, but we know those things because of the concepts or the definitions of the words that are involved. Um, and Ayer goes pretty far. He kind of pulls the rug out from under the rationalists when he says, look, yeah, sure, we can have a priori knowledge, but it's only about it's all to do with concepts and linguistic terms. It's not, you can't have a priori knowledge about the world, like about metaphysical things, which is what the rationalists traditionally have wanted, right? But anyway, um, so empiricists, it's all about analytic propositions when it comes to a priori knowledge. Um, but everything from the senses is known a posteriori. Um, and again, except for Kant, empirical knowledge is well, not except for Kant, because the synthetic a priori is still synthetic. But for these empiricists, empirical knowledge is reflected in synthetic propositions. And again, those are propositions where the subject concept is not does not contain the predicate concept. Then along came Willard Van Orman Quine, who looks like a very dapper fellow here. He published a very famous paper that was called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. We're going to look at the first dogma today. And the first dogma is that we can, in principle, actually distinguish between synthetic and analytic propositions. Quine thought that we couldn't because there's a circular definition at play. So Quine shows in his paper we can't distinguish between these statements, and he focuses on criticizing, the nature of our definition of analytic. So an analytic proposition, just recall, propositions are statements about the world. Analytic propositions are statements about the world where the subject concept contains the predicate concept. So all triangles have three sides. If I go and look at triangles, maybe I go around the campus and I try to find some triangles in the architecture or in some of the art installations. I could find some. I'm looking around. I don't really see very many triangles. But let's say that there's some triangles somewhere. I'm going to know ahead of time that they all have three sides and three angles, and that those angles should sum to 180 degrees. I don't need to go and investigate whether that's actually true of any of those triangles, right? Now, the thing is, analytic sentences, Quine argues, are synonymous. So, triangle, three-sided polygon mean the same thing. Bachelor and unmarried man mean the same thing. Joey and baby marsupial mean the same thing. Now, these sentences that contain the synonymy or synonymous expressions are necessarily true. So Quine is pointing out this little move here, right? We move from analytic to synonymy to necessary or necessary truths. And then we complete the circle. Which sentences are necessarily true? The analytic sentences. And that is circular. That's a circular definition. So question in the chat. Um, yeah. Well, the concepts, I would say, the concepts involved. Like think back to what we were talking about with Kant, how in an analytic proposition you have a subject concept and a predicate concept. The subject concept is picks out what the sentence is about, and the predicate concept, that's how we predicate. That's what's predicated to the subject. So if I say the apple is red, the apple is the subject. Red is the property I'm predicating to it. Of course, that's a synthetic statement that I just gave you. Um, but you get the idea. Yeah, they're definitions, right? Cannot. I'm not sure the question, Sohaila. What Quine is saying is that what is an analytic statement? Well, it's a statement where there is this synonymy, right? So, for example, let's go back a slide. Or wait, no, I don't have to go back a slide. It's right here. So, for example, all triangles are three-sided polygons, right? We know that's true a priori. It's an analytic statement. And these analytic statements contain synonymous expressions. So, of course, we can know a priori that triangles are three-sided polygons because triangle means three-sided polygons. And those synonymous expressions are the ones that contain the necessary truths. It's necessarily true that any triangle is a three-sided polygon, and any three-sided polygon is a triangle by virtue of how we've defined those things. Now, which sentences are necessarily true? Analytic sentences. So you see, we've gone in a big circle from analytic to synonymy to necessity back to analytic. And that's circular. And we don't want a circular definition because circular definitions aren't very good definitions, right? I like that everybody is using these animated figures. But boy, the way they move around is awfully funny, huh? It's a good way to keep yourselves anonymous, right? If you don't want your face on camera, yeah, you can be like a cat that goes, "Ah." It's really cool. So, so Quine is worried about this circularity, right? If we don't have this non-circular understanding of analytic, then we won't have a non-circular. Then we won't be able to understand what synthetic means and what synthetic propositions are. It boils down to the fact that Quine thinks we don't have a good understanding of the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions, and that is what he's trying to show with this argument. Just making sure we're good for time. One consequence of this is that we could actually deny any analytic proposition we wanted to if we made the right sort of conceptual changes. We can just alter the concept slightly, and we could make it so that what seems like it's necessarily true is not necessarily true. Now, this is a bit controversial, right? Grice and Strawson think maybe this analytic synthetic distinction is actually still helpful, even if the boundaries are fuzzy. What do you think? We'll come back to the second dogma of empiricism later, but what do you think? Do you think that we should retain the analytic synthetic distinction, even if the boundaries between the two are fuzzy? Nicholas, go ahead.
I don't fully understand the what's it called? Not the word for saying that they're equivalent. I forgot how English works.
Do you mean synonymous?
Yes, synonymous. Because analytic propositions are not necessarily synonymous. For example, all triangles are three-sided polygons is true, but I can't flip it. I can't say the opposite. I can't say that through all three-sided polygons are necessarily triangles. It's possible that a three-sided polygon is not closed. In
Wait a
which
minute.
case,
That well, then it wouldn't be.
then it wouldn't be a polygon. Correct.
Yeah, yeah. So
Okay.
it is. You can flip them. Um, the worry is so what it boil again, just to repeat, like what it boils down to is that there's this distinction, and Quine says, okay, well, we don't actually really have a good definition of what we mean by analytic. And if we don't have a good understanding of that, we cannot have a good understanding of this supposed distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. That's what it boils down to, right? But your example of like an unclosed polygon would be like an example of one of these compensatory conceptual changes. You could just say, well, maybe I think polygons can have uh, an open side, right? And then yeah, that might be an interesting example of that. William?
I was just wondering how that might apply to other, like, we'll take the polygons, right? Like, how it might apply to other polygons, like four or five-sided ones, right? Like, you can't say all five-sided polygons are pentagons, right? Like, it might, or I'd
Yeah,
say like all four-sided polygons are squares, but like that just isn't true. So, like,
yeah.
how
You
would
would
that
have
apply there?
you would have to be more specific. So you could say all regular four-sided polygons are square because squares are regular polygons. That means their edges all have the same length. So not all four-sided polygons are squares is true because you can have rectangles and trapezoids and rhombuses and so on, right? Um, but if you are just a little bit more precise, you can make it work. You can say all squares are regular four-sided polygons, and then that would work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that's clear. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sometimes details like this get left out in the sake of simplicity, but I like adding them back in. So now we're going to talk about Saul Kripke, who was um, at once both a brilliant and very strange individual. I don't like to get into too many autobiographical details of philosophers, but one thing I'll tell you about Kripke is that he once received a letter, I believe from the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, in response to a paper he wrote on modal logic. That's logic, the logic of possible worlds. You know, dear Professor Kripke, we would love it if you would come and teach a graduate seminar here at Harvard University. We found your paper very fascinating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Kripke writes back essentially saying, "Thank you, but my mom says I should finish high school first." You know, so very interesting guy. Also, incredibly um, socially obtuse. Had Kripke lived closer to the present, he would have been Me Too'd, um, owing to his behavior around, reports of his behavior around certain women, like colleagues, grad students, and so forth. So, I mentioned this it's not an ad hominem. I think it's important to know that philosophers are human beings, and while they can be very, very smart, sometimes they can also be problematic in certain ways. It doesn't mean that anything Kripke said about logic is necessarily, bad. In fact, Kripke has a lot of good things to say about that. Remember, we're all human. We're all, we're capable of doing wrong, even if we're smart. And we got to keep that in mind so that we can not do so much wrong. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not trying to say, oh, Kripke was a creep, so we shouldn't read him. That's not what I'm saying. And there are lots of other philosophers that are, Sartre and de Beauvoir were problematic. Martin Heidegger was a Nazi. Aristotle argued that it was okay to own slaves. Um, it's not unique to any one thinker, right? But as far as the good stuff that Kripke did, he has something interesting to say about the necessary a priori. Now, um, what rationalists and empiricists certainly agree on is that we can know, or that anything knowable a priori is necessarily true. But in the 1970s, Kripke came along and proposed that, well, some a posteriori knowledge also must be necessarily true. And what he's talking about here are he's talking about a particular kind of proposition called an identity statement. So here's an identity statement. Water is H2O. Now, that is necessarily true. I could go around the campus and I could try and find some water, right? Maybe I go into the Taranga Commons, the drinking fountain, water. I go down over there by the locks to the canal, full of water. Go over to the river, lots more water over there. Maybe it starts raining. Oh, there's some water. It's falling from the sky like manna from heaven. And so I know in each and every one of those cases that if I found water, I have found H2O. I have found something that is made of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, right? So it's necessarily true. Water is H2O is necessarily true. But we've only come to know that through experience. So this is a necessary a priori statement, right? Identity statements like this are necessarily true. So it had been most of the history of philosophy, throughout the history of philosophy, it had assumed that this connection between knowledge and necessity was a special feature of a priori knowledge. And it is a special feature, but some a posteriori knowledge is also necessarily true. Um, so now we know, okay, we know about the rationalists and the empiricists. We know about Kant. We know about Quine and Kripke. We know all about a priori and a posteriori knowledge, but we haven't really asked what knowledge is in general. And that is where we were going to go to next. So I'm going to get the next slides ready. And if there are any questions, now is a good time. I think we have one in the chat. Where's my mouse gone? There it is. Yes, because when we're using shorthand, we're using sense as a shorthand here. So like I learn water is H2O via the senses because I don't know. When I was a little kid, I was using my senses to watch the television, and Bill Nye the Science Guy came on and said water is H2O. And so I used my sight and my hearing to watch the television to receive this testimonial from Bill Nye the Science Guy that water is H2O. So that's the sense in which I learned it with my senses. Does that make sense, Pernille? Yeah, because there's like a rudimentary sense in which you can learn things with your senses. Like I can learn that the stove is hot by touching it, right? But I can also learn complicated things. Right now, you're learning all of this stuff about philosophy thanks to your senses. Like it starts with the senses. It doesn't end with the senses. You still have to think about what I'm telling you, but it starts with the senses. That's the sense in which we mean learning takes place via the senses. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now we're going to talk about the traditional analysis of knowledge. We're going to go back a few thousand years here, talk a little bit about Plato's famous dialogue, the Meno. It's named after one of the characters, Meno, who inquires with Socrates what virtue is, whether virtue is teachable, and or whether it's a gift from the gods or something, right? And toward the end of that dialogue, we get to this bit where Socrates tells us that um, true beliefs are well and good while they abide with us. Knowledge is more secure. He likens them to the images of Daedalus. Okay, so who is Daedalus and what are his images? Have we heard of Daedalus before? legendary figure from ancient Greece. Yeah, he built the labyrinth. Yeah, he built the labyrinth to contain the Minotaur for the king of Crete. Um, and yeah, he made wings out of wax and feathers, and he gave a pair to his son Icarus and said, "Don't fly too close to the sun." Of course, Icarus flies too close to the sun, and because of Icarus's hubris, the gods cast him down to earth, and he dies. Yeah, he flew too close. So that's what we call hubris. That's like arrogance before the gods. Yes, this it did, but the sun, Helios, is a god, right? Helios is carried across the sky in a chariot. So when we say the sun melted it, like the Greeks were kind of like animists. So yeah, the sun melted the wax, but that's because the sun is like a being, not a star, right? No, 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 it didn't really happen. No. The first flight still goes to the Wright brothers as far as we know. Um, it's like a lesson, right? One of the other things that Daedalus is known for is his images. Um, yeah, no. Well, I did say he was a legendary figure. But yeah, no, it didn't happen. The Greeks definitely didn't do that. But they wanted to teach people don't have hubris, right? Don't be arrogant before the gods because the gods can smite you, right? But another thing that Daedalus is known for are his images. Now, these are not images like pictures. These are graven images like statues or sculptures. It was said of Daedalus that his sculptures were so lifelike that if you didn't fasten them down, they would walk away. So if you had one of these images, you needed to keep it fastened down because it looked so alive that it would actually get up and move, right? Now Socrates likens knowledge and true belief uh, to one of these images that is fastened down versus not fastened down. He says true opinions are a fine thing and do all sorts of good so long as they stay in their place, but they will not stay long. They run away from a man's mind, so they are not worth much until you tether them by working out the reason. So just like Daedalus's statues, your true beliefs are great when you have them, but they can run away out of the soul. They need to be tied down by a reason. So that brings us to the traditional account of the traditional analysis of knowledge. Um, a lot of people read this as probably the first expression of this analysis of knowledge. And anyway, what it says is that knowledge is a special kind of belief. So knowledge is a justified true belief. And keep in mind, by the way, that when we're talking belief, we're talking about a kind of mental representation here. So, okay, what is the received view or the traditional analysis? Well, if some belief A is true, it's got to be because A is true, right? That's what a true belief is. A true belief must represent the world the way it is. So I've got on the slides that it's raining, but let's say I believe that it's sunny. And you can express that in the proposition, Josh believes it is sunny. Okay, so is my belief true? I think so. Because it seems to reflect the actual state of affairs around me. The sky is nice and blue. The sun is right over there, shining through the tree. Look, you can see the sunlight shining on me if I move around a bit. So, it seems like I have a true belief. And keep in mind also, not just that beliefs are mental representations, but that this is a realist view. Realism means there really is an external world that exists uh, independent of my mind. But I need for my belief to also be justified. I need good reasons for having my belief. That's what fastens my belief down and makes it count as knowledge. So, true belief is like I believe A and A is true. But knowledge is I believe A is true, and I'm justified in believing A. And then, according to the traditional analysis, my belief meets the required standards to count as knowledge. Um, there was a great question in the Discord about a priori knowledge and skills. Um, and I said that well, a priori knowledge really applies to like propositional knowledge. Likewise does knowledge on the traditional analysis. What we're talking about here is propositional knowledge, not what we would call procedural knowledge or knowing how. These are also examples of what we call necessary and sufficient conditions. So if you have a belief, that belief is true and your belief is justified, you have the necessary and sufficient conditions for that belief to count as knowledge. Just keep in mind we're talking about propositional knowledge, which is knowing that. So I know that Ottawa is the capital of Canada. I know that triangles have three sides. Pizza, I know that pizza is Italian American food. Um, what are some other examples of propositional knowledge? Could you want to volunteer some, everybody? Yeah, I know that I am looking at my screen. I know that yep, yeah, like knowing what you're doing right now or what's going on around you, that also would count. Yep. Carlton is in Ottawa. I know that I'm alive. Notice that all of these either have a that clause or an implied that clause. So for example, who was it here up here? Eliane, I hope I'm saying that right, says, I know Carlton is in Ottawa. There, you can think of there being like a that in parentheses in that sentence. Like, you know that. That's propositional knowledge. Yeah. Well, that's pretty meta, Nicholas. Nice. So that's all propositional knowledge. That's knowledge that. That's different from knowledge how, knowing how. That's called procedural knowledge. Like, I know how to use Google Maps to find my way from Ottawa or to Ottawa from somewhere else. Um, I know how to draw triangles and squares. I know how to make a pretty good pizza. Um, I know how to get to the pizzeria. You know, I know how to ride a bike. I know how to write an essay. These are all examples of procedural knowledge. So this is different from propositional knowledge. And just keep in mind that the traditional analysis of knowledge applies only to propositional knowledge. Talk a little bit more about propositional knowledge here. I once had a student on a quiz write. The question was something like, "Explain the justified true belief account of knowledge." And the student wrote, "Well, somebody is justified in their belief if they truly believe, and then it counts as knowledge." That's not the sense in which we're using true here, right? Where true means my mental representation actually represents the world more or less the way it is, right? It's not like believing more or less strongly. It's having a belief that matches the world. And justification, well, we're going to have a whole chapter on that next week. But what justification boils down to is having good reasons or good evidence for holding the beliefs that you do, right? So I believe there's a coffee cup on the table beside me. What's my justification? Well, I can see it, right? And then a skeptic could say, well, you could be dreaming, you could be a brain in the vat, etc. Sure, I could be. Um, but the best explanation is probably just that there is a coffee cup there that I'm seeing, right? Okay, any questions about the traditional analysis? before we move on? Wasps. I know that I'm surrounded by wasps. All right, well, we'll move on. So this this traditional analysis stood for over 2,000 years. But then in 1963, a fella named Edmund Gettier came along. Here he is right here. He published a short paper that was very influential entitled Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? And he offers counterexamples to the traditional analysis. These counterexamples, which we now call Gettier cases, these are cases where people have justified true beliefs that don't seem to count as knowledge. And so what Gettier was trying to do is show that holding a justified true belief might not be sufficient for knowledge. And this is my favorite example, reckoning time with a broken clock, which I do believe comes from Gettier's original paper. So let's say uh, you're in you're passing by one of your, you're passing by some classrooms trying to get to your class on time. You're wondering if you still have some time. So you look into an empty classroom and you see a clock. And the clock reads, I don't know, 11:30. And you say to yourself, "Oh, it's 11:30. I still have 5 minutes." Great. And it is actually 11:30. If you had checked another clock, it would have also said 11:30. But here's what you didn't know. The clock that you looked at was broken. It just happened to be stopped at 11:30, and you just happened to pass by at 11:30. So you have a true belief. It is 11:30. You have evidence, a clock that reads 11:30 when in fact it is 11:30. But Gettier would say that doesn't count as knowledge. Do you see why? Hmm. Yeah, broken clocks is right twice a day, right? Um, yeah, it's because you like basically, well, William, you're right. It's an unreliable, well, it would otherwise be reliable if it weren't broken, but since it's broken, it's unreliable. But Zahra, that this right here is it. It's like chance. You were lucky. You were epistemically lucky. Is there a difference between justified true belief and a justified belief? I suppose you could have a false belief and think that you have some kind of justification for it. And we're going to get to an example of that. So I'll circle back to this later. Yeah, it's luck. You were just lucky, right? Another example is from Keith Lehrer. This is the no got have it case. So our subject, who we'll call S, has good reasons to believe that her coworker, Miss No-Got, owns a Ford. After all, S has seen Miss No-Got driving a Ford. She's heard reliable testimony from her coworkers that Miss No-Got owns a Ford. So S forms the belief that somebody in the office owns a Ford. But Miss No-Got doesn't own a Ford. It's Miss Have-It that owns a Ford. So S in this case has a justified true belief. S believes that someone in the office owns a Ford, and S has reasons for believing that, and that belief is true. But we wouldn't say it's an instance of knowledge because the reasons that P has for holding this belief aren't connected to the truth, uh, or the reasons S have aren't connected to the truth of this proposition P. Someone in the office owns a Ford in the right kind of way. So S has a true belief. Someone does own a Ford. His belief that Miss No-Got owns a Ford is simply a false belief. and that Miss Havett doesn't own a Ford. That is also straightforwardly false. It's her belief that someone owns a Ford. S is correct about that, but S's reasons for holding the belief aren't connected to the truth the right way, just as with the broken clock example. So that's another Gettier case from epistemologist Keith Lehrer. Does this one make sense to all of you? Because Gettier cases can be a little tricky, right? I remember when I first learned about them, I was like, "Oh, well, I mean, I don't know, I really have to think about these. These are interesting. Got to keep a lot of details in one's mind in order to think about things like this." But do you all follow this example? Very good. And if you don't be afraid to speak up and let me know. Can I give another? Yes, I can. I've got another one right here. Okay, not gonna lie. Okay, so let's go through this last one, and then I'll try and like help out in case it hasn't stuck by then. Alvin Goldman has the facade example. So in this example, we've got this rural countryside sort of place, and this film crew is filming a movie there, and they've had to set up a bunch of barn facades along the road where there are a couple of real barns, but they needed more barns. So rather than build the barns, they put some Hollywood sort of barn facades up. Now, one weekend, a father is taking his son for a drive, and he's passing a few real barns and a lot of barn facades. And it's a little kid, so dad's driving, and he's like, "Look, son, that's a horse. That's a cow. That's a barn." And he points to a real barn. So he goes, "That's a barn." Now, did the father really know that that was a barn? Well, Goldman says maybe not, because the father could have just as easily pointed to one of the facades and said that's a barn, and he would have been wrong. So again, in this case, we have a justified true belief as long as the content of his belief, what his belief is about, is a real barn and not a barn facade. But remember, he could have just as easily pointed to a barn facade. So just how, like, in my example, you're lucky with respect to the broken clock being at having stopped at the time it did when you passed by. And just as in the No Got Ford case, S is kind of lucky in his belief that someone in the office owns a Ford. Here, the father is lucky that he pointed to a real barn and not one of the many barn facades. If he'd pointed to one of the facades, he'd have had a false belief because the content, what his belief is about, is a real barn, not the facade that he's pointing to. Okay, now I can take your questions. What's troubling you about Gettier cases? No. Finn, that's a good insight, but I would say no. I would just say that's a false belief in that case. Although some people would disagree with me. They would liken that to the barn facade example, right? I would say no. I would say those are what we call misperceptions rather than Gettier cases. Because when we have a Gettier case, the evidence we have matches the content of our belief, but it's not connected. The belief and the evidence in the world aren't connected up in the right way, but the content matches. But with a mirage, it's just that we've misperceived something. Um, But again, Goldman's example kind of stretches it. So there are going to be people that would disagree with me, probably. So I'll qualify this by saying, in my opinion, I don't think it would be the same. You might get an answer from somebody else that's different than mine. Yeah. Someone else. I just want to check. Uh, well, that's the thing, right? If the justification is foolproof, we wouldn't have to worry. Um, it wouldn't be a Gettier case if it were foolproof. Um, it's when we're kind of epistemically lucky. That's when we run into these Gettier cases, right? Any other questions or concerns about the Gettier cases? Okay, so the takeaway, just to reiterate, according to Crumley, as he writes on page 50, the traditional analysis leaves open the possibility that a person's reasons or justification might not be appropriately connected to what it is that makes the belief true. So the traditional analysis might be a little too weak. Um, and what these cases really imply is that where you could have had a justified true belief and therefore knowledge, had things just been a little bit different, you would have had a false belief. Um, So it's like we're lucky again, right? If things aren't just a little bit different and we think we have a true belief or knowledge, that means we're kind of just lucky. And most epistemologists don't think our knowledge should be achieved by luck, right? Because after all, epistemology comes from the Greek episteme, which means understanding or certainty. We don't want to be lucky. We want to be certain in our knowledge, right? Some more questions. Would my bus will be late tomorrow count as an example? Um, an example of a Gettier case? I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't see how that would count as one. Um, well, in that case, in the clock case, your justification isn't foolproof, like Samir says. Yeah, because clocks can break, right? Because clocks are mechanisms after all, and they can break. Like if you do a math problem and get it wrong, but end up at the right answer, how would you, what? I mean, that wouldn't be a Gettier case, but that would just be a true belief. Like imagine I did a math problem and I made a mistake and did something wrong, but I still arrived at the correct answer. We wouldn't be able to say that I know that's the answer. I had a true belief what the answer was, but it didn't count as knowledge. It doesn't have to be something happening in the present. Yeah, yeah, luck. It's luck. So where do we go from here? Well, Gettier cases do something useful for us. They expose what we call defective justifications. A defective justification is when our justification just isn't good enough because there's some information out there that we're not aware of that could defeat our belief or cause us to change our beliefs. We call these sometimes Gettier facts, right? So if I were aware that the clock I looked at was broken, then I might question whether it really is 11:30. Like, oh, it's 11:30. Oh, wait, that's that classroom where they've had that broken clock for a while. Is it really 11:30? Hey, I'm going to ask this guy to tell me the time, right? That would be a Gettier fact if I were aware of the fact that the clock were broken, right? Propositions that express Gettier facts are called defeaters. So as Crumley says on 52, a defeater provides some reason for thinking that one or more of the justifying beliefs or assumptions is mistaken. And this leads us to something that we call the indefeasibility view of knowledge. So, a true belief is a case of knowledge if and only if it is indefeasibly justified. That is, there are no true propositions that could undermine S's justification for the belief. So, remember, defeasibility means potentially defeatable. So, if your knowledge is indefeasibly justified, that means there are no true propositions that could defeat your belief, right? There are no defeaters out there. So I've got we can skip this question. Can you think of any defeaters for the Gettier cases we looked at earlier? Just in the interest of time, again, think of the clock, right? If I looked at the clock, formed the belief that it is 11:30, and then I realized, oh wait, that's that room where everything's broken. Maybe it's not 11:30. That clock might be broken, right? Um, so in that case, my belief that it's 11:30 is not indefeasibly justified. My belief is defeasible. No. I would say that again, that's a misperception, right? Because I mean, cars all look quite similar nowadays. All cars are like those weird compact SUVs nowadays, right? Not all cars, but and they all do look quite similar. In that case, I would just say that's a mistake or a misperception, not a Gettier case. It, imagine though, a similar idea. Imagine that I have a Tesla and then I become embarrassed of driving it. So I take off all the identifying markers and then I put, Honda markers on. And then if you saw it and you'd say, "Oh, Professor Redstone drives a Honda." Well, no, that would still just be a false belief. Yeah, people were actually doing it. That's why I thought of it. But that would again just that would not really be a Gettier case, right? Yeah, that's true. I do like the way Hondas look. And then again, I don't drive. I don't have a horse in this race. I take the train. Um, so knowledge, another important thing here is knowledge ought to be extendable. And what that means is that new information shouldn't weaken our justification. So if I have a belief, and my belief is true and indefeasibly justified, that means that my beliefs are, my beliefs not only count as knowledge, but my knowledge is extendable in the sense that new information, my knowledge shouldn't be immune, my knowledge should be immune to new information. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't be able to change my mind, right? We shouldn't read this that way. If I have a false belief and I come across some new information, I should alter my beliefs, right? Because I want all of my beliefs to be as true as possible. So if I have a false belief and then some evidence presents itself which shows that my belief is false, I got to change my belief. But if I have true beliefs that are well justified, I can know that they're true and well justified because they will withstand new information. Are Gettier cases beliefs that are based on the senses and not the passing of info? Well, the senses is a kind of passing of information, but again, think of the No-Got Ford case, right? I mean, sure, S saw somebody driving a Ford, and he's heard also testimony that someone in the office has a Ford. So it's a little of both, right? Again, I would hesitate to say that a case like that is. Then again, I really need a more concrete example. What I would do, I mean, I don't really assign homework, but what I would do is I would say try and think up some Gettier cases over the weekend. So yeah, knowledge ought to be extendable. There could also be misleading defeaters, right? There might be defeaters that defeat a belief that you've had, but the defeater is false. So, uh, a misleading defeater, quote, undermines a justification because only a part of the story is known. And I'm actually really glad that Crumley uses this example. I think this is a great example, and we might end it after this discussion. But is anyone familiar with the controversy that surrounded Andrew Wakefield's claims about the MMR vaccine? This is a bit old now. The study came out in the 90s, and it really blew up in the early 2000s. Yeah. So Andrew Wakefield was this doctor um, who did a study which he claimed showed that the MMR vaccine causes autism. Now, the claim that we're concerned with is that the MMR vaccine is safe and effective, which, by the way, it is. Um, but Wakefield's study made the claim that that this vaccine caused autism. If that were true, it would undermine C. It would undermine the claim that the vaccine is safe and effective. Now, by about 2010, wow, crazy to think this is already 15 years ago. The medical community knew, and a lot of the general public knew that Andrew Wakefield had faked his data, right? His paper was retracted, and he actually lost his license to practice medicine over this, which he should have, frankly. Um, in 1999, if you believed the MMR vaccine was safe and effective, then this would have been a misleading defeater because you would, oh, this study, it was published in the Lancet. It says that it might not be safe and effective. Um, okay, I got to change my belief. Now that's a defeater, but it's misleading because it turned out to be false. So that defeater in 1999, this would have been a defeater, but it was misleading. And only part of the story was known. We didn't know in 1999 that Wakefield was a fraud, essentially. Right? So, um, yeah. So do we all understand why what a misleading defeater is? There are a lot of misleading defeaters. Let's see. Yeah, false pretenses cannot be part of a justification. It's a defeater because it would have undermined your belief, but it's misleading because it's not true. Again, because of Wakefield's fraudulent activities. So I think you've got it right, Khalid. I mentioned we talked about the news last week. Um, and I hate bringing this up again because it's like all I'm hearing about, right? The assassination of Charlie Kirk, right? And a lot of people on the extreme right say, "Oh, this was a left-wing person, a radical left-wing person who did this." A lot of people on the left who are saying, "Well, it was obviously a right-wing person." We don't know. Like we still don't have a very good picture of what this guy's what's his name? Robinson? Tyler Robinson? We still don't have a complete picture of his reasons for doing what he did. So there are a lot of misleading defeaters out there right now. If some people believe one thing, there's some kind of misleading defeater. People on the other side of the spectrum believe this, there's some misleading defeaters. We don't know. In this case, it might be best to be a skeptic, to be a skeptic in the Pyrrhonian sense, to withhold our judgment until the truth is completely evident. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, what was the walls? What was that about? They published a thing how see, I can't even remember. Like I've been flooded with so many different takes that I can't even keep the story straight. Right, they claimed the shooter was transgender, and of course, I don't think so. Now it's looking like he may have had like a transgender roommate or partner. Um, and it seems like they're cooperating with the investigation, but we still don't know. Well, even that, the idea that it's all fabricated. Like, I mean, remember the principle of parsimony, right? Conspiracies aren't very parsimonious. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it matters whether it was extreme left or extreme right. He shouldn't have done what he did. Um, yeah, the memes. That's why this is so fuzzy. Like we don't know. And I'm even getting to the point where I'm getting too old to understand the internet culture that this shooter seems to have been stuck in, you know? Yeah, I mean, yeah, the bullets, well, Trump didn't directly do anything to Jimmy Kimmel. It was the FCC and ABC seemed to cave under pressure. Kimmel wasn't really saying it was or wasn't a right winger. Kimmel was saying that the MAGA crowd were desperately trying to show that that he wasn't MAGA. He might have been, he might not have been. Like I said, I don't know, right? Uh Yeah, oh yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, the more I learn about Charlie Kirk, the more I'm like, wow, awful person. Um, I don't think he debated in good faith. The whole there's a lot of discussion going on now about how freedom of speech and how we should counter bad ideas with good ideas, not bullets. And of course, I agree with all of that. But but that's not what Kirk was doing. I mean, Kirk was not doing what he was doing in good faith. It doesn't mean he should be murdered for it. Um, it's all just awful. Like the whole situation is wacky. I never thought that I would see such things in my life. Yeah, Finn, maybe you're right. Yeah, yeah, try. I mean, Galen, yeah, I don't like ignoring the news. I need to watch the news. I like to be an informed citizen of the world. Um, well, William, I understand, but this is philosophy. This is philosophy. It's important to be an informed citizen of the world. Um, but since we're talking about epistemology here, you have to be aware that when we don't have the full picture, be aware that there are these misleading defeaters out there. Um, and that goes for everything, not just this, everything. I mean, why are we doing what we're doing? Um, we're doing it because we want to understand what knowledge is, how we know when we have it. This is not just an academic matter, right? Imagine if everybody thought about knowledge this carefully. It might be a better world. We might live in a better world. So the no false premise view. Anyway, yeah, that's why I was hesitant to bring it up because I knew that the chat would kind of go off the rails, but we're doing okay for time. We actually are. The no false premise view says that false beliefs can't enter into our justification. Um, and on the no false premise view, when we have a Gettier case, what's happening is that people are relying on false beliefs for their justification. So again, if I look at that broken clock and I think, that clock uh, says 11:30, so it's 11:30, I have this underlying false belief that the clock is working. And worse, I'm not even aware that my belief is false, right? Then there's reliabilism. I think we might make it to the end. Or we can save reliabilism for next time. Well, a misleading defeater, I wouldn't say it's got a purpose. Maybe this is better for the chat. I think everybody wants to take this out of the chat and go to the Discord server. So we'll finish up on this slide on reliabilism. Then we'll tie everything together next time briefly before we move on to theories of justification. Yeah. No, I agree, Zara. I agree. But let's move that to the Discord server. Like I brought that up to talk about defeaters. Um, I realize it's a hot button issue, and I'm not trying to discourage discussion. I'm really not. It's just that I want to get going, you know? So reliabilism, remember we met Alvin Goldman a little while ago? Well, we didn't meet him. We encountered his ideas in the slides. He's an advocate of something called reliabilism, and here, um, what's really salient immediately is connection to the truth, right? That's the primary element when it comes to the justification that we have for our true beliefs. Oh, that could be because I'm outside. That could be why I'm glitching. So on reliabilism, we have a belief is justified if there's a reliable connection between the belief and the truth. And that is to say, like as Goldman did, that there's some reliable belief forming process. Um, that's got us to arrive at the belief we hold. These processes are psychological or cognitive processes. Um, that's what um, that's what Goldman focuses on. David Armstrong is also a reliabilist, but he focuses on reliable connections between beliefs and the environment. In either case, justified beliefs have to come about on reliabilism in a way such that they are likely to be true. So reliabilism is like less certain than the traditional analysis, or it seems less certain, right? If we wanted to formalize this, we could say of reliabilism that for your true belief to be justified, the belief must be the result of a reliable process, and there must be no alternatives that could lead you to have a false belief, and the belief must be true. So, just by way of discussion, again, think back to the clock example. Well, looking at clocks is a reliable process for forming beliefs about what time it is. So, we've checked off number one. And there must be no alternatives that could lead S to have a false belief. We can't check that one off because there is an alternative. The clock is broken. It's not even an alternative. That is what's going on. The clock is broken. And the belief must be true. We can check that one, but because I did not rule out that the clock was broken, we could say that I don't have a justified true belief on that sort of schematic. We still have two slides left, but I think what we'll do is finish those very quickly next time. Um, and then we will move on to discuss theories of justification. So for next week, you're going to make sure that you want to make sure that you've read chapter 3. Great discussion again. Um, And if you have anything, again, like we can discuss things outside of class. If you have things to say about current events, we can talk about that on the server, as long as we do it like, nice and respectfully and we're cool for everybody. Um, oh, is it? Well, yes, but it's online. So, uh, 4 or 5, I haven't settled on the answer yet. But remember, the quiz is open for the whole week. And then you decide when you want to start writing it. And then once you start writing, there's a time limit. It's not on Tuesday. Um, it's it's the whole week. Yeah. There will be a few multiple choice questions, but not many. And yeah, it'll be everything up. It'll be chapters 1 and 2. So, you know, I would hold off on doing the quiz until after Tuesday once we finished covering reliabilism. But it is due Friday. That's right. Yes, it's open book. You can use your notes, my slides, the book, whatever. You cannot copy and paste anything. You cannot use Google. You cannot use generative AI. So open book does not mean you can use search engines, generative AI, or just copy and paste your notes directly in. Do not do that. You need to give me the answer in your own words. Yeah, classes are running as usual, and you'll complete the quiz on your own time. Paraphrasing is fine. Chapter 3 is not included in the quiz, only 1 and 2. Yes, you can use lecture slides. You can refer to them. You can't copy and paste things. I will penalize you for that. It might take 2 weeks to get your marks because this is a very big class. No, as I said, chapters 1 and 2. This is all in the course outline, by the way. All right. I have to get going to my next class. You cannot use Google at all. You don't need to. If you've been paying attention, taking notes, studying, you don't need to use Google. Using search engines or generative AI will be considered cheating, and you will receive a 0. And you will be referred for an academic misconduct report. Yeah. Okay, thanks everybody. I gotta run, okay? Great class. I'll see you next week.